Strength in Leos. Welcome to Strength in Leos.
How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Strength in Leos podcast. I'm Evan, the host, and welcome back to the podcast. We're here with session 5 of the podcast, bringing on Brian Butler of Altitude Exotics. Super excited to bring you guys this episode of the podcast. As you guys know, this is mostly a Leopard Gecko podcast where we interview Leopard Gecko breeders and people that are somehow involved with Leopard Geckos. But every once in a while, I do like to go out to the fringes and just explore other parts of the reptile hobby and the reptile industry. And this is another perfect example of one of these episodes. So Brian works with Crested Gecko, super awesome, amazing, high-end stuff. And just in general, I do not consider myself to be a huge fan of Crested Geckos. A lot of them, to me, just look the same and kind of just different variations of the same thing. But one thing that caught my eye about Brian's work is just the contrast in his geckos and just how they look completely different from a lot of what's already out there in the hobby, and just his mind into business and with photography and so many awesome things that are also touched on this episode. So make sure to check out this episode even though you may not be super into Crested Geckos. I promise it'll pay off. It'll be something you'll be interested in, and I hope you enjoy it. Before we go on, I want to say thank you to our sponsors. Impeccable Gecko is a small to mid-sized family-operated hobbyist breeder operation. They specialize in leopard geckos with high-quality genetics. Their goal is to provide customers with the absolute best animals that they could produce, coupled with honest and transparent business methods. At Impeccable Gecko, integrity and animal welfare are above all else. Impeccable Gecko is a strong supporter of the Strength in Leos podcast, so follow them on social media and check out what they have available. John of Gecko Boa started early, like most of us, catching lizards and snakes in his backyard at any chance he got. Over the years, he has kept and bred more than 80 species of reptiles. In recent years, his focus has turned to specializing within the genus Eublepharis. He has worked hard to pioneer some of the most cutting-edge leopard geckos while maintaining genetic purity and honesty. He also keeps the most diverse collection of pure Eublepharis species in the world. He has coordinated with biologists around the world and has contributed DNA sampling and distribution range info to help sort out the cladistic relationships within the genus. Check out geckoboa.com for more info and available geckos. Suburban Geckos is operated by Chris Charlton. Chris's passion and enjoyment for herpetoculture, and more specifically leopard geckos, drove the desire to take his hobby to the next level. With experience in breeding and raising reptiles well over 20 years, Chris is dedicated to producing quality animals for both the hobbyist and breeder alike. Suburban Geckos treats each animal with the utmost care and respect, and cuts no corners when it comes to health and integrity of their geckos. What started off as just a couple aquariums has grown into quite the collection in just a few years, and they wouldn't have it any other way. The dedication to their animals is unparalleled and evident in the quality and health of their animals that they produce. Exemplary customer service is another area where they excel. They're readily available to answer any questions you may have regarding their animals, husbandry, and etc. For more info and to see their availability, check out suburbangeckos.com. Blizzy Bold Leos, while new to the scene, is taking strides in following the footsteps of top-tier breeders and keepers in care and ethics while aspiring to bring fresh looks and crosses to explore latent potential. Prior to becoming a breeder, Greg of Blizzy Bold Leos completed hours of extensive research on lines, ethics, morphs, and how certain traits interact with others in order to begin projects which are coming to fruition already in the second season of breeding. With a major focus on line breeding the correct way and customer service done right, Blizzy Bold Leos aspires to be a breath of fresh air to the customers and keepers they encounter. Be sure to check out their Instagram, Blizzy Bold Leos, and stay up to date on project development, availability, or just tips on having healthy animals in your care. Dab Exotics is a hobbyist breeding operation that was started in 2017. They specialize in producing healthy leopard geckos from top quality genetics. Dab Exotics is an awesome supporter of the Strength in Leos podcast, so follow them on social media and check out what they have available for sale. Shane Kelly is a blue-collar, working-class guy that has a reptile breeding business with his wife and kids. They are currently working with high-quality ball python morphs, western hognose snakes, and select leopard geckos with a focus on bold stripes, and they're looking forward to adding Albie Snow and Ghost this year. They have been listening to the podcast since the beginning and are proud to be a Season 4 sponsor. Go check out their social media, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and also check out their Morph market to see what they have available.
Just the detail of what you see in your geckos and picking stuff to hold back. So when it comes to just being selective with kind of the morphs that got you into Crested Geckos and kind of how you are now, what kind of was going on in your mind when it comes to being selective with your original breeders?
I learned early on, I was given some good advice of, and it's still today, I get this message from a lot of new breeders where they'll message me and say, hey, I want to have a business. I want to do this for a living like you do. What morph should I breed to make the most money? And I was very lucky early on. I was given the advice that that's the wrong way to go about it. I think the way it was put to me is quality always sells.
Right.
Don't breed what's worth money. Breed what you're passionate about, because that's where you're going to find the most quality. You're passionate about it. You're going to put the most effort into it, and you'll get the highest quality results. And then that quality is what's going to attract business, not chasing the dollar signs from the get-go, because then your quality is going to drop off because you're not doing it for quality. You're doing it for money.
Yeah.
So that's why there's morphs that people love that sell for a ton of money, and I'm like, I have no interest in doing that. It's just not, I'm not interested. And yeah, I could probably hatch some and make some good money off them, but I learned another lesson I learned was doing wholesale, like mass breeding Cresties for wholesale. I did that for a little while, and it got to the point I was hatching 5,000-6,000 geckos a year.
It's insane.
So, I mean, compared to like the big guys, there's guys that are hatching 40 or 50,000 a year.
Yeah.
But I got to the 5,000 level and was like, this isn't fun.
Yeah.
I don't like, I've got 800 breeders right now, and they hatch a lot of babies, but it's no fun. It's just geckos for the sake of geckos. That's not what I enjoy.
Mm.
So, that was another idea that I tried. I made a little money at it, and then I realized this isn't what I'm passionate about, and therefore this isn't what I'm good at, so I should just stop.
Yeah. So like you're just revealing all of my mistakes. To every mistake I've done in breeding, just always looking for that quality and going for that. And I feel like there's just a lot of just commonalities that people hear, and it's nice to kind of just air those out, and you being open about some of your failures and how you've kind of just gone back to the drawing board and then really use that to build your success in the future.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of lessons that the same, like everybody learns the same lesson over and over, and even if, for the most part, if somebody tells you you're going to learn this lesson,
right,
you're doing it wrong, people still do it. Like, it's hard.
Yeah, exactly.
To not learn yourself.
Yeah, I feel like it's also easier because when you make that in the long run, because when you make that mistake yourself, you're like, man, I produced a ton of geckos this year, and they're not enticing to me. It's not something that I enjoy doing, so let me just go back and do something another way and kind of just try things until you land on what works for you. And maybe that might work for someone and they enjoy that, and it all depends on what works for them.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that do. That's their whole business model, is hatch as many animals as I can and wholesale them out. And there's a lot of hate in the reptile community for people like that. They tend to get a bad rap, and you don't care for your animals, you're in it for the money. I've never held that opinion. I think those people are incredibly valuable. Going back to the beginning of our conversation, how did I get into Cresties? I went to PetSmart and saw one at PetSmart. That gecko was hatched by somebody who hatched 30,000 other geckos that year. It was sold to PetSmart for $18, and then PetSmart resells it for $45. And that gecko is sadly, most likely going to end up in a home where it doesn't get cared for properly because PetSmart doesn't give proper care advice. Like, all of that's sad, and there's definitely improvement in that ecosystem for proper care and to find the animals good homes where they'll live good lives. But that ecosystem in general, I think, has an enormous amount of quality.
Right.
I was having this at the Schomburg show this weekend. I was having this conversation with a friend, and I used to be in the music industry, and way back in the day when everybody was on MySpace was so good for music, because everybody was on MySpace, but they had dedicated band pages. Okay. So I could get my band in front of you to make you listen to it because you're already there. Right. You're on MySpace. My band's on MySpace. It's easy to get your eyeballs to me. People used to come up to me after MySpace fell apart. people in the industry would come to me all the time. Oh, we're building a new social media site for musicians. What do you want to see in it? And I always had the same answer. I said, it doesn't matter. Because if you're building it for musicians, it'll never work. Because the only people on it are musicians. I don't have trouble getting other people who like heavy metal to listen to my heavy metal band. They already like heavy metal. I need to get people who would never normally see me to see my band. Same thing with reptiles. There's a reason that PetSmart is so much better at getting people to love reptiles than your local reptile shop. Because if you go to your local reptile shop, you already love reptiles. You probably already have a pet reptile. If you go to Petco to pick up a bag of dog food for Fluffy, and you happen to see a Crested Gecko like I did and go, this is the coolest lizard in the world, you may never have seen a reptile. You may never have seen a gecko. You never would have fallen in love with this world, except for you were there to buy dog food and they happen to have a gecko.
You never thought about that.
I do think is so important for the reptile world in general. It just needs a lot of improvement because the way they go about it ends in tragedy for a lot of those animals.
Yeah. No, that's a super awesome insight that I've never even really thought about, especially when we talk about kind of the bigger chain pet stores and just how that plays into the ecosystem of reptiles, and especially when we're thinking about specialized businesses and people who are, you're not getting the same person and the same kid walking into pet store or PetSmart or Petco looking to your website and trying to get a Crested Gecko from you. And if they are, they're probably not going to find what they're looking for because they're looking for kind of a pet quality animal, something that's a little bit lower price. So it's getting those people funneled in to see what we're about. And really, I think you do a great job with that on your social media and your YouTube page to funneling people in from the bigger crowd to into your business.
Exactly. That's the entire idea behind my YouTube channel. When I started that, like I've had it forever, but at one point I got focused on, okay, I'm going to make all these kinds of videos. And that was the entire idea is if I make how to set up a cage for your first Crested Gecko video, nobody who's watching that video in a serious way is going to buy a gecko from
Right.
me. Nobody that's watching how to set up your first cage is going to go to my website and buy a $600 lizard. It doesn't work that way. But they might go to PetSmart and buy a $40 one, and then they'll like it, and they'll say, oh, you can get one with stripes down its back, I should get one of those. And then 5 years from now, when they're looking for a breeder because they fell in love with it like I did, then they're looking to buy from somebody like me or somebody that does a business like mine. And that's how I got into it. I think it's important to get those people and expose them to our world, and some of them are going to leave, some of them are going to barely dip their toe in and leave, and some of them are going to be lifers.
Yeah. No, and that's super awesome to even think about just the reach. And I think a lot of people, when they think about this, and even if they're coming at it from a business standpoint, they think of like the ROI of like how many of these people are actually going to buy one of my geckos, or how many of these people are actually going to convert into a sale. But it's really thinking about the long term of the reptile industry. There's, someone who came up to you, and when you finally got into breeding, kind of helped you out and taught you the ropes how to breed and got you your first gecko, or, depending on something you needed help with in terms of setting up a cage and just things like that when we talk about education in the reptile hobby. And I think reptile shows are also an awesome good thing. We're talking about the Schaumburg show that you were just at. So it's really cool to think about just the long term of like what we can do when we actually just put our passion and showing our passion to the masses out there.
Yeah, definitely. I agree.
And that's really where it comes to. You're just like a guy on YouTube who talks about geckos and how much you love your geckos and helping people set them up. And you think of that and you're like, that's just so bizarre, but it works in terms of getting people into the hobby and to see what you're doing, what you're excited about.
Yeah, and it's double-edged for sure. There's like, I never have any, like there's some guys out there that I'm completely altruistic and I just want to help people love their animals. Like, for one, that's just 99% of the time a face that people put on because they want to look like that guy. Like, I just don't have the patience or the care, and I think it's inauthentic to try and play that role. Like, I've never hidden the fact that, part of my motivation is this is my business. This is how I make a living. This is how I feed my children. I'm doing this so I can convert you into a customer.
Yeah.
But that's not the sole reason. Like, it's also, I love these animals. I've dedicated my life to these animals, and I got here because I saw one at Petco and then went to a reptile shop and talked to the guys there and then went to a reptile show. It's like all those steps along the way. Well, yeah, if I'm a couple of those steps, I'm turning you into a sale, but I'm also helping you find something you're passionate in. And, if you're not passionate in it, you're not going to be a sale. So they almost go hand in hand. It's like nobody's going to buy one of my geckos if they're not passionate about geckos.
That's true. And also if
So-
they think that you're not passionate too.
Yeah, it's a win-win for me. It's like, yeah, I'm turning you into a sale, which is good for my bottom line, but I'm also helping someone discover something they love and build that love and build their own breeding collection. And like, how is that a bad thing? Like, it's a win-win.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's kind of what it's all about. So yeah, just super cool to hear you talk about that. I kind of want to turn to kind of some of the projects you're working with. Your Lilly White
definitely.
axanthic stuff, like, blows my mind. Just coming from someone like not in Crested Geckos, who's dealing mostly with Leopard Geckos. Sometimes I look at Crested Geckos and there's obviously some variation, but some of them are like just different variations of like brown and creams. But then when you see that animal, it just blows your mind. So what was your journey like into just that project alone? And then we can kind of talk about your other stuff.
Yeah, so that project is one that's really close to my heart. That was a great example of I have an image of this gecko in my head and it does not visit and never has physically existed and I want to bring it to reality. And you always have that question of what's it actually going to look like when you make it? Is it even possible to make it? Will it be healthy when you make it? Is it viable? And then will it look like what I picture it will look like? And that's one case where everything lined up
Wow.
perfectly and they look even better than I thought.
Yeah.
It was like, it's been amazing working with those animals. I've got wildly lucky to be able to work with them in the first place and then to have everything work out as well as it has. It's been astonishing, frankly.
True. That's so awesome to hear that and think about like that vision that we were talking about earlier come into reality. Did you think that just the combination, because I know Lilly White is, I guess, kind of new on the scene, and then also axanthic is much newer than the Lilly White, but there's not a lot of like actual base morphs and Crested Geckos. A lot of it is line breeding. So was that kind of your original goal when you got both, that you wanted to combine them and see what they do together?
Yeah, it definitely was. So Lilly Whites are actually newer than axanthics
Really?
are, technically. But the main thing is axanthics literally started with one
Okay.
animal. They took so long to get to a point where they were, like even now, they're not available. Like if you wanted one, good luck trying to get
Right.
one. They're just so
Is that just
rare.
because it's
And Lilly
recessive,
Whites,
or
it's mainly two things. Recessive for one, and for two, when I had the first axanthic line, I purposely did not just mass breed the crap out of them like a lot. Like the Lilly Whites they're also co-dom, so they're much easier to
Right.
produce, but they were mass produced like crazy. The same thing with like the new cappuccino and super cappuccino morph. Even the super form, which is essentially the same as recessive, those are being mass produced so heavy right now, they're going to far outstrip axanthics in availability within a year or two. And axanthics have been around for almost 10 years. But that was I purposely did that with my personal business plan when I had that project, because I don't want to just mass produce and flood the market with them. I was like, yeah, I'll make a lot of money up front, but for one, I won't make as much money over time because I'm going to tank the price on my own animals. I'll make a big chunk up front, but it's a big chunk up front and then it dies in a couple of years. I wanted it to last a long time. And it also helps other people. You know, if I sold you an axanthic and then I sell you one and I've got 500 of them that I'm going to flood the market with in the next 6 months, you're never going to make your money back. It's like, I don't want to do that to the community either. I want to make good money for myself over the next 10 years, but I want the people who invest early to have a chance to also be able to, make good decisions for their own lives with these animals. That's the whole point.
yeah.
So that's a big part of it. I've never mass produced them the way a lot of other morphs have been done.
Yeah, and then so the story behind that for a lot of the people who don't know where axanthics and Lilly Whites come from, can you kind of just give like a quick overview of overview stories of kind of both morphs?
Yeah, so the Lilly White started with a breeder overseas, hatched one out and identified the trait over a couple year span. Lilly Exotics was the name of the company. That's where the Lilly White name comes from, is from their company name. So they all come originally from there. The axanthics are a bit more interesting. So I got mine, a girl in London who was just like a hobbyist who had a few breeding pairs. She had two that she knew were half siblings. And she was cleaning their cages, told her husband, don't put these two together while I clean, because she didn't want to breed them. She knew they were siblings. And he actually misheard her, thought she said put them in the same cage, put them in the same temp tank while they were cleaning their tubs, and they bred. Completely by accident. Well, their baby hatched out an axanthic.
Crazy.
I found that there were other axanthics before those ones, and I'm would be willing to bet if you go back to when the first wild-caught Cresties were imported, one of them was a het axanthic, and that gene has just been kind of around for 20 years, and it just took 20 years for somebody to accidentally breed two hets together and then also be able to identify what the baby was. Because if you think about it, these guys that hatch 50,000 Cresties a year, they get one weird-looking little gray baby, and it either gets totally overlooked, just shipped off to Petco somewhere, or they don't really or some kid happens to hatch one and doesn't even know that the gray one is something special. Like, I'm sure there's been tons of them throughout history. That was just the first line that was identified. And then I got very lucky with them. I immediately, I knew what it was right away when she posted pictures of it, and I immediately completely invaded her inbox. I was like, dude, you sell it to me. I want it. And then originally she said, no way, I'm not selling these. And then it got to the point where she was like, all right, well, I recognize I don't have the ability to do this project justice. I'll sell you some of them. And that she quickly turned into, I'll sell you the whole bloodline. But the reason I was able to get them was, again, pure dumb luck. I'm just an incredibly fortunate individual. She was born and raised in London. Her, at the time, fiance, now husband, was actually born and raised in Denver, Colorado. So I had connection with her husband because we're both from Denver, and they still traveled here occasionally to see family. So I was actually able to meet them when they came to Denver to see family one time. And it was just that connection is why they, of all the people blowing up their inbox, they reached out to me and said, we need to move this project. We'd like to work with you. It was just that dumb luck that we happened to both be from Denver.
So what I'm hearing is you got to say you're from the same place where the person's from who sold it to you.
Yeah, well, if you want anything from anybody, be like, dude, I'm from Boston too. How about?
Then they'll give you the whole project.
Yeah, that helps. It gets you in the door.
Nice. If anybody takes anything from this episode, that's what they're going to take away. They're just going to say that's where they're from. They're like, oh, do you know this place? And they're like, yeah, somewhere from around there, Just say, 26th Street.
As soon as we hang up, I'm going to check my Instagram messages, and it'll be full of, hey, dude, I'm from Denver. Can I buy some cool geckos?
Yeah, say, there's probably, number streets in, every big city, so just say, yeah, I'm, on 30th Street, and that's where I'm from.
Yeah, that goes right off 30th and Broadway. Every city.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's hilarious. And that's also awesome, a crazy story how... Just in reptiles, it's crazy when we hear about some of these morphs and just the origin stories of some of these morphs, especially recessives, where it's almost just a ton of incidents that kind of lead up to where they are now. And even seeing where you've taken the project in the years that you've worked with it, and just how you've taken just the quality as well with it, and not just mass producing it and making just 1,000 just kind of good looking axanthics, but you're really working on kind of the low quantity and then the high quality, which is super cool to see that.
Yeah, and it's weird to say low quantity because in general Crested Gecko terms, I'm not very low quantity compared in the big picture, but for specific morph breeding, I'm extremely high quantity.
Okay. Yeah.
Compared to most people that are breeding for high-end designer animals. There's not many, if any, that hatch more than I do. So in that sense, I'm very high quantity. But in the general reptile world, like I said, the people that are supplying Petco and PetSmart are hatching 30, 40, 50,000 a year.
And they're also not hatching out the stuff that you're hatching out. So.
And that's, that goes back to little company logo things. I don't want to hatch 500 axanthics a year. I want to take them and make axanthic pinstripes and axanthic superdowels and Lilly White axanthics and all these. Like I said, that's why this is one of the projects that's so close to my heart, is the stuff that I'm producing now is levels ahead of the stuff I bought from the girl in London. And that's what I love. That's the whole point for me is, can I take this and make different, better, more interesting, never before seen versions of it? That's the whole point. That's what I love
Right.
doing.
So you already have the axanthic Lilly White, and you've already produced a couple of those, and you're already putting it into different things. But where do you think the future of that project lies, and kind of like the pinnacle of pinnacles when you're thinking of down the line, 10 years from now? What is that next big thing when it comes to this project?
The next one that I'm focusing on is axanthic super Dalmatians. The axanthics that get the most views and are the most popular right now are the super dark black ones. They're just the most eye-catching. That's what everybody wants. But they're just like every other gecko. There's different variations, and there are ones that are very light that they're pure white when they're fired down, and then they almost don't fire up at all. They get like dark gray. And I have, again, that vision of an animal that doesn't exist in my head. I have this vision in my head of white, really light axanthic just covered in huge black spots. So those are my most popular super Dalmatians, are the really light yellow, almost white ones with black spots. Like, how much better would that look if it was completely void?
Yeah. No, that would be insane. Yeah, to think.
It'll take, some years obviously to create, but that's my next vision of, I think that would be spectacular.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's also super cool that it almost is really similar to leopard geckos as well, where we have kind of the morphs, but then also we have a lot of line breeding that goes into the geckos. And it's kind of when you mix those parallels of line breeding and then also morphs to get kind of these super awesome combination and just make things that have never been seen before.
Yeah, definitely. And it's even messier in crested geckos, because the main problem with trying to identify mutations in crested geckos is, in theory, if I had a corn snake with 5 different mutations and didn't tell you what it was, you could take it, breed it back to a normal, and then just keep crossbreeding it and outbreeding it. And you could eventually isolate all the different traits and be able to tell me exactly what that snake was. There is no normal crested gecko. There is no one specific wild type crested gecko. It doesn't exist. So there is no control to use to say, if I have this one and it has these different visual appearances, let's backbreed it and figure out what these are, how they interact. A lot of that we have no idea.
Yeah.
We have no idea how many different mutations there are, how they interact with each other. We don't know if this one looks like this and this one looks kind of like that, but it's a little different. Maybe it's 3 different mutations that interact in a way that kind of look like this one, but they're genetically completely different.
Wow.
Like, there's so many possibilities that are hard to figure out. We've come a long way in 10 years from back in the day when people refused to think there were any reliable mutations in crested geckos, and it was just a total shot in the dark. Like, that's quite clearly not true, but there's still a long way to go to try and figure everything out.
That's crazy. So I'm curious, when it comes to like lineages and looking at lineages of these animals in different lines of certain projects that people are working on, how important is that to the crested community?
There's kind of 2 answers to that. It's very important from a breeding standpoint, but it is vastly more important to the community than it should be. People in the crested world are, for some reason, far, far more obsessed with what are the exact parents of my gecko versus what line, what traits, what mutations went into making this gecko. That's the biggest complaint I get about my company is 90% of the time I don't provide parent photos. And people are like, I can't buy that gecko, I can't breed it because I didn't see the parents. Like, well, the parents don't matter. Here's what it is. Like, can you imagine buying a pastel pied spider ball python and then being like, no, I don't want it because you didn't show me pictures of the parents? Like, but the parents don't matter. It's pastel, spider, and pied. You don't need to see what the parents are. People are so obsessed with, I have to see the parents, and sometimes people want grandparent photos, and it's like, yeah, the lineage and the mutations and what it has matters a lot more than I need to see the exact parents. But that's just one of the quirks of the crested world, is people love direct lineage. They love to be able to trace. There's people that can trace back all the geckos in their collection 5 generations and have trees of every photo of every gecko that got bred to make theirs. And it's like, but that's not really what's the most important for breeding. It's cool, it makes you feel good, but from a breeding perspective, that's not as important as a lot of people think.
Okay. So from your standpoint, what do you think if people are getting into this and are figuring things out in terms of like morphs and lines and such, what do you think people should kind of go into, I guess, spending most of their time learning about?
I almost wish we were doing this in a couple months because it's not out yet, but I actually spent a lot of time talking with Big Tom up at Schaumburg. He's working with a lot of breeders that are kind of compiling a master list of different morphs and mutations, what's been figured out, what's been isolated, what all the different reliable traits are versus what's just variations of line breeding and selective breeding. And they're kind of compiling one big document that they're eventually going to publish with Pangea in conjunction with Pangea. That I haven't looked at it. Like, I haven't been too involved in it. I spent a lot of time talking to Tom about it this weekend at Schaumburg, and it sounds incredibly promising. I assume it will be mostly, like, I will look at it and go, yes, I agree with all of this. I can't say that because I haven't seen it, but I know the guys that I don't know well, but I know of a lot of the people that are putting the work into it, and I expect it'll be relatively, if not incredibly accurate. And, like, that is going to be something that you can point new people to and be like, here's just an amazing base to start your research on. Look at this document. That's as big a leg up as you can possibly get. He told me it should be within a few months they should have it published, so definitely the Pangea guys do a lot of articles and stuff like that about gecko genetics, and that's going to be a big one that they're going to work on.
Nice. Wow, that sounds super awesome, and just promising that something like this hasn't been done before, and it's finally being offered to kind of people to understand and get ahead on just getting genetics better and being able to, I just have just the information more accessible to just people who want to get into it.
Yeah, not just more accessible, but just the idea that people are now they're taking serious the idea that a lot of crested gecko morphs do follow traditional genetics versus, there was a joke that was real popular on like Pangea forums and stuff back in the day that, like breeding crested geckos is like pairing an apple with an apple and you get a banana. It was like a way to say that there's like, no, it's not like that at all. It's totally predictable. The problem is, breed this gecko and this gecko and you don't know what mutations they have. Yeah, you might get a baby that looks completely freaking weird.
Right.
Because you know, like, there were maybe recessive traits, or maybe a trait this one had combines with a trait this one had to make something that looks totally different. That doesn't mean that it's not predictable. It just means we don't know what to predict. We don't know what the mutations are. And now that idea is kind of fading into antiquity, and it's being taken a lot more seriously. That, yeah, this does follow traditional genetics, and these are mostly predictable morphs. We just don't know what they are, and now we need to do the work to figure that out. I think that's going to make a big change in the next 10 years of how people breed and what we can see and what people
Right,
make.
exactly. And that's just like saying if you didn't know, like, probabilities of certain morphs, like, that's kind of what it sounds like. Just people aren't understanding how the genetics work and how certain genetic traits are being passed down, because if you just think about any reptile, for that matter, and you just pair random things together and you're like, well, this doesn't make sense because you pair it this time and you get a certain ratio this time, but then you pair it with this animal, you get a certain ratio, so it must be random. When it's not random, you just don't understand what's behind it. Yeah.
Exactly. Or the idea that, the babies don't look anything like the parents, that must mean it's a crapshoot. Well, no, like, think of ball pythons. You can pair two basically normal, almost plain-looking ball pythons, and a leucistic pops out. It's like, well, that baby looks nothing like the parent, but that's not random. That's not just like, a freak occurrence. There's a reason that's happening. The ball python world is years and like light years ahead of the cresty world on understanding why does that happen. Let's figure it out. But again, ball pythons are much easier to work with too because everything is very straightforward. Whereas cresties, it's not straightforward.
Right.
At all.
Yeah. Are there things that you feel like you've noticed that you've been trying to get people to notice and get on the same page about, or has it been kind of just a crapshoot in terms of that?
The big argument I've had for years is the Dalmatian trait. People, for one, it bugs me when people say, well, that's not a morph, it's a trait. What? Those words mean the same thing.
Yeah.
What's the difference? A morph is a trait, is a mutation. Like, there's no such thing as, well, it's a morph, not a trait. What? That's not even a statement
interesting.
that makes sense,
Yeah.
for one. People say that but it's only the crested world. As you'll never hear a ball python go, well, yeah, that gecko has white splotches on it, but that's not a morph.
I've never heard that before. That's really interesting.
That's not. It's not a statement a ball python breeder would. He would look at you like you hit him with a shovel if you said that to a
Right,
ball python
yeah.
guy. But it's a statement that Crested people make to say, no, that's not a real mutation. It's just something that happened. Nothing just something
Right.
happens. Everything happens for a reason. We just don't understand the genetics. Dalmatians were a big one like that, where for years I've said Dalmatians a codominant trait. It either, like, if it doesn't have spots, it won't produce a kid with spots. And then people, no, I had a gecko that had no spots. And then you find out, well, does that gecko have a tail? No. Could it have had Dalmatian spots on its, even if it had one Dalmatian spot on its tail, it could make offspring with Dalmatian spots. Or you'll get, my favorite is people used to say, I haven't seen it in a while, but they used to say all the time, oh, if it has between 1 and 20 spots, that has the Dalmatian trait. But if it has more than 20 spots, it's the Dalmatian morph.
That's crazy.
Can you imagine if you had a clearly a pied, a very low expression pied ball python, and you told somebody, well, that one's not pied enough to be pied. Like, it either has the mutation or
Right.
it doesn't. If it has one Dalmatian spot, it is genetically a
Right.
Dalmatian. It doesn't need to have a number of spots. It has
Yeah,
the
it's like you're
mutation.
either pregnant or you're not pregnant. It's not. There's no. There's no being half pregnant.
We used to say all the time, that doesn't have enough Dalmatian spots to be considered a Dalmatian. It's not considered a Dalmatian. It genetically has a mutation that causes Dalmatian spots. I don't care if it has 1 spot or 5,000
Right.
spots. It's genetically a Dalmatian. Like stuff like that. Like I said, thankfully is fading into antiquity. Like, our knowledge has come a long ways. And the general knowledge as that kind of thinking is starting to fade out a lot, but that was Crested Gecko breeding
Wow.
for years and years. Is that's the way we thought, and that's what people just thought. Just pair 2 kind of looking similar ones together and see what comes out.
Yeah. Wow. That would just blow my mind. Thinking about that.
It's a wild
Yeah.
world.
No, I'm really glad I asked that actually, because it's like I feel like every like part of the reptile hobby like has their quirks and certain things like that, and it's really interesting just seeing how different sectors of the hobby and people working with different animals, how they see things and genetics and different things like that. So
Yeah, it's definitely strange. There's like every group has their quirks, and Cresties we have a ton of quirks. I've always said I think a big part of it is, obviously this is no blanket statement in the world ever works because people can't be covered by a blanket, but a generalization I make about Cresty people is a lot of these misconceptions are because Crested Gecko people aren't reptile people. A lot of people that love Crested Geckos love Crested Geckos, and that's about it. They're not also snake people. They're not general reptile lovers who kind of focus on Cresties. You know, Cresties they're easy to keep. They're great starter pets. They're super cute, and they're easy to
Right.
handle. And that brings in a lot of people that's the only real reptile they interact with. So they're not reptile people,
Cresty
they're
people.
Cresty people.
interesting.
And I think that's why a lot of this general reptile knowledge doesn't infiltrate the Cresty world, because they're not the same
Yeah.
world.
So just kind of like starting from scratch and just like figuring things out as time goes.
Exactly. And then you add on top of that the issues with Cresties. There's no wild type. There's no easily identifiable mutations. There's no way to reverse engineer mutations with a wild type
Yeah.
animal. Like, that whole mess in itself would make everything messy, and then you add in everything else. It's just...
Yeah, pain in the butt to deal with.
It's a very fun, very beautiful
Right.
nightmare, but it's
Yeah, a nightmare that you love to be in.
Exactly. It's not a bad thing. It's just, like, it's a nightmare has negative connotations. That's not the right word. It's a circus. We'll put it that
Nice.
way. It's wild. It's crazy. Nobody knows what's going on. But goddamn, is it a lot of fun.
Exactly. Yeah, and it seems like you're having a lot of fun, and it's really just interesting to see, just from an outsider's perspective, how the market has changed in the past 10 years in terms of just like what you guys have been doing in terms of quality, just pricing on Crested Gecko. Sometimes I just walk through a show and it's insane on some of the prices of Crested Gecko. So what do you think has kind of just driven that? Because I've always been confused, like, what are people just getting into Crested Geckos now, or what do you think from your standpoint has kind of driven a lot of attention into Cresteds now?
I think, like most things in the world, there's not one factor. It's a multitude of factors. I think a big part of it is the first few easily identifiable genetic mutations. Like axanthic is quite obviously recessive. It is very easily identifiable as recessive. It's a trait that reptile people from outside the Cresty world already know. Like, a ball python guy doesn't identify with Dalmatian spots.
Okay.
But they know what an axanthic is. That's
Right.
easy. Most reptiles have an axanthic mutation, so it translates to outside people. You know, the Lilly White gene being so easily identified as incomplete dominant is technically the correct trait. Yeah, I think that has brought people that weren't interested in Cresties, has brought them in, for one, so it brings more experienced reptile people in, and those people tend to be more business-minded, more high-budget-minded. You know, you get somebody who's used to the ball python world looking at Cresties, and damn, these things are a steal. They were the most expensive one 10 years ago was $1,200. You know, that seemed like a good deal to them at the time. So I think that's part of it. I think another part of it was global shipping used to be really, really hard. It was very difficult and very expensive, and now markets in certain parts of the world have opened up that have just exploded the Cresty market, because now, like, there was a year, I still do a lot of business with South Korea, but there was a couple year span where 70% of what I hatched was going to South Korea, because we opened up easy, reliable shipping lanes between us and them, and their market had a great demand and very little supply of high-end Cresties, and just everything was going to Korea for years.
That's crazy.
And I see other markets where that could happen. I get a lot of inquiries from Hong Kong, and there's not really a reliable, like, I've done it before, but it's, you know, we need an intermediary. Korea's easy. I've got several brokers I can call, and they arrange the whole thing. When I ship to Hong Kong, it's like I have to find my own exporter here in the States. They have to have somebody with the proper licensing and permitting in Hong Kong, and then we got to get them together, and it's very intensive. Versus, like, if somebody steps in and sets all that up and has an open shipping lane, and then I just call that one guy and say, here, I got 10 to ship to Hong Kong.
Right.
That's what happened with Korea. So I think eventually, like, Hong Kong's a market that I get a lot of inquiries from, and South Africa is another one. Eventually, I've always said, like, if my business ever starts to falter where I'm, like, sitting on geckos and having trouble selling stuff, I'm going to fly to South Africa and hire, like, get a little office, hire a guy with an export license to sit in it, and then just open up that South African market, because I get so many inquiries from them, and I don't know how to ship to South Africa. I don't have any contacts there. I have no idea what the export laws are there. Like, I just don't have a way to get it done. But I assume that the demand's going to get high enough, somebody will figure it out, and then that market will open up.
Yeah, it's even interesting how you guys have, like, the overseas markets.
One show in Germany. Yeah, for years there was one show in Germany, and you could ship to and from that one show, the Terracotta Ham show. For years, like, I think they did 2 shows a year. Like, every 6 months, for an exorbitant fee, you could get animals back and forth from that one show. And now it's so much easier to get animals all over the world.
No, that's super awesome, even thinking about it from a global perspective of marketing, just different people getting into reptiles. And I think that's another way how, like, social media kind of helps, and seeing people from different places get more eyes on these things, because there's so many more people, not just in the US to focus on, but other people who are like, oh, what is that thing? And why does it look so cool? And then they see variations. And it's kind of like that going back to the same story, just people get interested. And then once they get the bug that bites them, it doesn't discriminate based on where you're from.
I was going to say that was another factor to how everything is blown up is Facebook, because before it was Pangea forums, the Repashy forums, and, you know, other Cresty specific places. And it's like, well, only Cresty people are there. We're not getting any outside eyes because you don't go there unless you're interested in Cresties. Then Facebook blew up, and the way MySpace, I would explain, MySpace was great for musicians 15, 20 years ago. Facebook is great for reptile breeders. Facebook doesn't have a platform for musicians. It's terrible for the music industry. It does nothing for them. But reptile breeders can make a Facebook page, and now it's easy to get a mom in Tulsa, Oklahoma to see my cute geckos because she's already on Facebook. All I got to do is pay $8 for a Facebook ad, and it's going to pop up in her timeline. it's easy to get her eyes to see my animals. And that's another reason that so many people are into Cresties, because people didn't know they existed. And now they're all over Facebook. It's easy to find
It's
them.
crazy. And they're all over, they're taking over reptile shows too. Now it's like they're getting close to, I know like at big reptile shows, it used to be just all ball pythons, but now Cresties are kind of sneaking in there to get their lane in shows.
Yeah, I mean, I was just at the Schomburg show, and it was by far ball pythons were the most common, and then Cresties were probably the second most common animal there.
That's insane. Just think about that, and just how far the market has come since like then like people thinking they were extinct to kind of like where they are now, which is really crazy to think about. I know you're kind of a big traveler, so would you ever be interested in like going over to like South Korea and kind of these other places to see about like I know they have shows there and stuff like that, or just to check out what it's like over there?
Yeah, I'd love to. I've got a lot of contacts in South Korea, people I do business with, a couple people that I'm very friendly with, that a lot of them have asked. I get questions all the time, would you ever come out here to a show? I'm like, well, I couldn't come vend a show because that's just not logistically possible. Like I can't remember which one. There was a big leopard gecko breeder that used to do that. Like he would fly to Germany and export 300 of his geckos into Germany just to vend that show. And then he would go to South Korea and export 400 geckos to South Korea. And like it's a lot of paperwork and money to export them. And he would go through the legwork of exporting 400 geckos because he knew the demand was high enough. I'm going to sell every one of these at the show. It's worth it to him. It's worth it to me. I can't imagine that.
Yeah, it's like shows here are just hard enough.
But I would love to go there, like, just visit a show and see all their animals and meet some of these people I've been doing business with for 5 years. They're just an Instagram handle to me.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
I actually have the Vegas show. I do have one customer from South Korea that's flying all the way to Las Vegas just to shop my animals at the show. Like was very humbling when he hit me up. And, it's very broken English. It's hard to communicate. He hit me up. I was like, are you still doing that show? You'll be there, right? I said, yeah. He goes, good. I bought a plane ticket last week. I'm going to come. And I was like, are you right? Because, like I said, it's broken English, very different cultures. It's kind of hard to communicate. Like, make sure I'm not misunderstanding you. You're flying to Vegas from South Korea just to see what animals I bring.
That's awesome.
So, like, that was very humbling for one, and also it's cool. Like, it'd be nice to meet somebody I've talked to on Instagram and never met from a totally different culture, and have this kind of a conversation with somebody from such a different background. And how do you keep your geckos? What are your projects? It'll be fun. I'm looking forward to that.
And it's super cool just to hear about stories like that and just how the reptile industry connects people, not just even like from across the U.S. and, meeting up at the big shows, stuff like that, but just even globally, it's crazy to think how many people are just into reptiles. I know even for me, like, it's crazy just like looking at podcasts and like having people like just DM me like, hey, I'm a breeder from Indonesia, and it's cool to like, see people like that. And you're like, wow, it's like you don't even think about people overseas like that, but to see people getting into it, it's super awesome to hear that from other places.
It is, and that's another part. We touched on this a little bit before we actually went live. That's another part that I've completely ignored for years and years, because I'm a fairly introverted person. Like, as much as I could sit here and talk, we could do this for 4 hours and I'd still be talking about geckos. But in the real world, like, I don't have many friends. I'm very introverted. I rarely leave my house. The Schomburg show last weekend was the first expo I've even attended, like been to as a fan, in 7 years.
Yeah.
Because I never leave my house. And I've been taking steps. Like 2 years ago, I would have never done this podcast because I didn't want to. 4 years ago, I was terrified to start a YouTube channel because people might see my face. Like, especially the last 2 years, I've really been trying to take steps, like, get out there more, meet people more. I started, if I could shamelessly plug my other business for a moment, I started an adventure retreat business where I take people on trips to Belize, and we go hike through the jungle and jump off waterfalls and search for snakes, and it's like an adventure retreat to go sit in the jungle for a while. And really, I had two motivations behind starting that business. One, I really don't make much money. Most of the time I lose money doing it, but I'm like, if I can break even, cool, I get to go on 2 vacations a year, essentially for free. Like, I broke even running the trip. Who doesn't love free vacations? And it forces me. My main idea to do it was like, I need to interact with people. I don't have anyone to talk to in my life. I want to meet reptile people. So if I do these trips, I'm going to be with the most people I can take with me is 8. So I'm like, I will be with 8 people who are there specifically to hang out with me and go find snakes for 6 days.
Take awesome pictures too.
At a deserted lodge 8 miles deep in the middle of the rainforest in Belize. Like, I have nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. I have to sit here at dinner and talk to these people. It's going to make me make friends. It's going to make me interact with other humans. Like, I spent so long just sitting in this basement building a breeding business. I completely quit doing that. I'm like, I got to get out more. I got to start going to shows and meet people. I want to have conversations.
No, that's insane, because I consider myself to be more introverted, and that's extremely bold to be like, oh, how am I going to get out in the world? Yeah, I'm going to start a business where I take people out to a different country and just meet random people.
I was literally the girl that my main gecko caretaker, her name's Draven. She's fantastic human being. My whole life would fall apart if it weren't for everything this girl does to take care of my animals and run this business. When I first came up with this idea, I was like, hey, Draven, come here, I want to tell you something. I told her about this idea, and she listened to me, and I was like, I have this idea, we're going to go and take all these people, and I'll be the tour guide, and take them to all these favorite places I visited a few times in Belize, and all my favorite spots to take photos, and she listened to the whole thing, and then when I got done, I was like, what do you think? And she just looks up at me and goes, why would you do that? You hate people. That was her exact response. Why would you do this, Brian? You hate people. I'm like, no, I don't hate people. I hate being around people. And I want to do that because I don't really hate being around people. I'm just so used to not doing it. It's easy.
Yeah, Crested Geckos are a lot easier than people. That's to deal with and manage.
Exactly. They don't talk back. You don't ever have to navigate any social situations. They just, like, the worst they do is poop on your hand. Like,
hopefully nobody that you're taking on trips pooping on your hand.
Not yet. Luckily, I've been lucky. We've had very low number of weirdos to show up. No, honestly, they've been great. It's been people that I've become very close friends with. A few people that have come on these trips. It's always an amazing time. Like the first one I ever did, it's weird how like the dynamic of the group kind of dictates how the trip goes. The very first one I did, we were a very close-knit group of people. We all got to know each other very well, but it was a very relaxed, almost spiritual, emotional trip. Like one morning, we got up at 2 a.m. to hike up to the top of this 1,000-foot waterfall and watch the sunrise. It was absolutely beautiful. And then the next night, we flew home the next morning. It was our last night there. And at dinner, we were like, okay, this is our last dinner, and then we're going to bed. That's the end of the trip. And somebody brought up the idea, well, it was the Perseid meteor shower was going on that night. And they were like, oh, we should drag our lawn chairs out and lay in the clearing and watch the meteor shower for a bit tonight. And I said, well, why don't we climb up Antelope Falls and watch them from the top of the 1,000-foot waterfall? Wow. Which was a crazy idea to climb this huge waterfall in the fertile ants-infested forest of Belize at midnight. And we were like, that's a So a group of us went up and we just laid. I'll show you the video sometime after we get done with this. You'll be blown away. It's literally a 1,000-foot waterfall, and you can sit right at the top of the waterfall. And we climbed up there and laid on the rocks watching the meteors for like 3 hours. Just laid there watching the stars go by in the meteor. It was amazing. But it was a very emotional, very spiritual trip. And then the next one I did, different group of people. Our last night, I was trying to recreate it almost. I was like, all right, we're going to climb up the waterfall and watch the stars. And then that totally fell apart, and we ended up having a bonfire in the clearing at the lodge and busted out a bottle of whiskey and a bunch of drinks and ended up just having a raging bonfire party. And it just turned into this crazy bonfire party because that was the dynamic of that group. And it was like, it was just a straight party fest the whole time. The other one was like, sit in nature and connect with the earth. It's whatever people show up really dictate what interesting it is, and it's awesome.
No, it's probably amazing even just like seeing that, because you never know what to expect. Also, what situation you're going to be in too.
It is. That's kind of what I've learned doing it. Is I can set the itinerary and know what we're going to do, but I have no idea what to expect. I don't know who's going to show up, what kind of personalities we have. But I've never had a bad person. Like that was one of my fears. Like, what if I get that weird person that like for whatever reason, socially, politically, they're like just way out there and totally disconnected from everybody else, and it makes it super weird and awkward. Like that's never happened. It's always just good
Nice.
people, which I think is like, that's just what
Right.
most people are. That most people are just good people. We all get along and have a good time, and it's an amazing trip every single
Wow,
time.
that's awesome. So, just why? I'm just curious. Why Belize? And out of all the places.
I went to Belize when my wife graduated with her master's. We went there as her celebration trip for her getting her master's, and I just absolutely fell in love with it. There's a few reasons I picked Belize specifically. I love the rainforest. That's like it's where I belong. I love being in a rainforest. And Belize it's fairly close. It's easy to get to. It was until all this madness we're going through now drove the prices of flights through the roof. It was cheap to get there. When things are normal, it's about between $300 and $400 round trip for a flight. Right now, it's anywhere between $300 and $1,200,
Wow.
depending on when you buy your ticket and where you're from. Like, it gets wild now. But regular times, it's fairly cheap round trip to get there. They're an English-speaking country, so it's very easy to navigate. Everyone speaks English. And I tell people it's like Costa Rica light. Like, Costa Rica's the dream.
Right.
It's not quite as diverse as Costa Rica, but they've done an amazing job preserving their rainforest, so there's a ton of rainforest to explore. It's closer. It's way cheaper than Costa Rica to visit, and they speak English, so it's easy to navigate. It's a beautiful, beautiful country. They've got tons of wildlife and beautiful, pristine rainforest, and it's just a great place. It's easy, and it's a great place
You
to go.
sold me. I'm ready to hop on a plane and go to Belize. Yeah, we have to.
They also have the second largest barrier reef in the world outside
Yeah.
of Australia. The snorkeling is incredible. The scuba diving, if you're into diving, it's the best diving site in anywhere in the Americas. Like, they have so much to offer.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I'm ready, ready to hop on a plane and get down there. Nice. Well, Brian, I really appreciate you. Had a great conversation, and really appreciate you just spending your time here on the podcast today, getting to know more about you.
Of course, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
on.
definitely. It was awesome. Great time. It's not often where I get to, go into different parts of the hobby, and I'm like, awesome guy, awesome YouTube seems like. So we got to get him on the podcast and see what he's all about.
Yeah, dude, I appreciate you having me on. It was interesting. Like I said, we didn't really talk much before I came on, and I didn't really know. I got some idea it's a reptile podcast, but yeah, it was neat. It was definitely a different conversation than other ones I've done before to get into the business side and all of the things that we talked about. Like, it's not many people talk about that sort of stuff. It's nice and kind of refreshing to have that kind of a conversation and find somebody that's actually interested in that instead of just, what's your top 10 favorite gecko morphs?
Right, yeah.
Those
That's
are the
for
type of
YouTube.
questions I get. Yeah, like it's not just the traditional questions. It's been a great conversation. I'd be happy to do it anytime.
Hopefully we'll be able to get out to a show soon, and we'll both be there and talk shop and stuff too in the future.
Yeah, let's keep in touch. If we're both in Tinley, we'll connect.
Nice. So at the end of each episode, we kind of do our fast rapid fire questions. So just to wrap it up, is that cool with you?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Nice. So are you an early bird or a night owl?
Early bird.
Nice. Books or TV? Cool.
Books.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee in the morning, tea at night.
Yeah,
I
that's
guess.
a good combination of both. Chocolate or vanilla? Okay,
Vanilla.
nice. Weekends or holidays?
I'd have to say holidays,
Okay,
probably.
nice.
Oh, and weekends aren't nearly as important to me as they are to most people because I play with lizards
Right.
for a living. Like, my day job is freaking awesome, so I don't live
Every
for
day's a weekend for you.
Exactly. Like, I love my life, so weekends are just more
Nice.
great
Okay,
days.
this is probably going to be hard, or maybe not, but Lilly Whites or axanthics?
I did a TikTok about this once. Hands
Have
together,
them both.
man. To mix them both.
Nice. Best of both worlds in one gecko.
If I had to pick one, I'd pick axanthics. They just are special to me. But definitely, you just mix them, and then it's the best
Nice.
choice.
Okay. Now, last question. Favorite reptile morph of all time? Any species? you could pick?
Reptile Morph. I'm trying to think through a whole bunch of different stuff. I have a few answers that come to mind. One that I've always loved, and it's a very weird answer because it's not the most striking morph in the world, but tri-stripe ball pythons.
Interesting.
For some reason, a good clean stripe. Like, I just love the way those look. I think they're super cool. And then the other one, I don't know if it technically classifies as a morph, but yellow phase eyelash vipers.
Those are...
I don't know. I think eyelash vipers are bred enough to know if that's a mutation, like if it's a recessive. I don't know what it is. I just know most eyelash vipers are fairly plain, and sometimes you get the bright yellow ones. I've seen one of those in the wild. Absolutely.
They're just striking, just some of the photographs I've seen of those things.
So, supposedly, where I go on my retreats in Belize, they have eyelash vipers there. I've been told by the forest rangers they're there. I've been told where to look for them and what plants they like to hang out on. I've never seen one. That's my two bucket list animals in Belize is an eyelash viper and a wild boa. I found boas in Belize, but I've only ever found them crossing roads. I've seen a couple DOA on the road, and I've pulled a couple off the road. So I've seen wild ones, but I want hiking on a narrow path through the jungle and come across the boa, like deep in the rainforest. I've never had that, so that's a bucket list.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds awesome. But again, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. And yeah, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you, learn more about your business, how could they get in contact with you or see some of your stuff?
Yes, all my available animals are at altitudeexotics.com. AltitudeExoticsAdventures.com is my travel website if you're interested in taking a trip with me. I will, again, shameless plug, I'm working with some guys in Kenya. I'm going to start running adventure retreats, safaris in Kenya.
Wow.
In 2023 as well. So that's coming. And then social media, my handle is AE Geckos, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, AE Geckos. It's the same across all the social media.
Nice. So hope everybody enjoyed that. So today we're here with Brian of Altitude Exotics. Brian, thanks for coming on and welcome to the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Definitely. So it's kind of crazy how I even just stumbled upon you. So I think it was back during the pandemic, and I just got like a new DSLR camera, and I stumbled on your video of like taking pictures of reptiles, and I'm like, this is awesome. Finally get like a way to figure out how to take pictures with my new camera, because it's totally different, like going from an iPhone to using a nice camera that you could, fix, and then learn all about aperture and exposure and all that good stuff. So I'm like, okay, what is this guy doing? And then I stumbled into your Crested Geckos, and then from there kind of fell into a hole of
down the rabbit hole you go.
Yeah, exactly. So it was kind of crazy just even like how I went on to like figuring out how to use a camera for capturing reptiles to kind of seeing what you're doing with Crested Geckos, which is super cool.
That's cool. That's interesting to me that you came across me with that video. That's one of those videos that like nobody watches it. It was terrible for views. Like it did nothing for my channel. But I really liked it because I've seen so many times, like I'm sure you've seen it too, where people in groups or forums will say, hey, I bought this fancy new camera so I get better picture of my geckos, and it takes way worse pictures than my phone did.
Right,
and that's the reason why is a real camera can take much better pictures if you know how to use it. It's a tool. You have to know how to use it. If you don't know how to use it, it's a lot easier to just point and shoot with your phone and you'll get better results. So I kind of made that video because I got tired of seeing that comment. It's like, well, let's try and help people learn what do you need to do with this camera, how can you use it, what settings should you use, and get proper pictures of your animals, because that's the whole point. And it's sad seeing people waste hundreds of dollars on nice cameras that they just end up using.
Yeah, and it's kind of crazy because even like my first 500 photos were like just terrible until I like figured out how to shoot on manual and like not just going from automatic. And I'm like, why is the flash always coming on, and figuring it out. And then even like taking pictures of a reptile is a totally different skill set than if you're like going outside and taking pictures of other things. So it was cool to get kind of that perspective of taking pictures of reptiles and not just other things that a ton of other photographers would take pictures of.
Yeah, that's the thing about photography is if you're not into photography, you think a picture's a picture, a photographer's a photographer, one camera's the same as, but it's like landscape and portrait and animal and all these different types are totally different from each other. Photography is a huge passion of mine, so I'm super into that kind of stuff.
Nice. Well, we got to get more videos in there with photography. I'll be up for that, and I'm gonna watch all those videos. Nice. So, just in terms of reptiles and you being in the reptile hobby, how did you get your start into reptiles? And obviously now you're into crested geckos mostly. So, what was your start and upbringing into that?
So reptiles, I've been into reptiles since I was a kid. My very first reptile when I was a little kid, I'd say 6 or 7 years old. We went for a walk, like a family walk around a lake, just like a local park, a state park or something. And we caught a little garter snake, and my mom, for some reason, decided to let us take it home, which is wildly out of character for my mom. I can't believe she did that. I distinctly remember she had a very old, like a 1989 Ford Taurus, like a big old school station wagon, and it had a built-in trash can in the center console. It was like a removable trash can. That was the big selling feature in 1989. And we put it in the trash can and took it home with us. I don't know why I remember that detail so well. But that was my first day. We had it for probably 3 days before I got out in the backyard and we lost it. But that was my first experience with reptiles, and from there I've been finding, hunting, catching, and keeping reptiles ever since. It's kind of kicked off a lifelong time. That was my whole childhood, was out crawling through ditches looking for snakes and lizards.
Nice. Yeah, that's super crazy because I feel like when you hear most people's, I guess, like reptile origin stories, it's like their parents not wanting them to get reptiles. So then when they got older, they got that passion later. But that's crazy to hear that your mom let you take the garter snake home.
Yeah, I agree. I hear that story all the time. That's actually an idea for my mostly defunct YouTube channel that I just never have time to actually update. But one of my many video ideas in the back of my head is want to do a video that's like specifically 5 arguments to convince your mom to let you get a crested gecko.
Nice.
Because they're such good pets. They're such good starter pets, and I get that question all the time. I want a gecko, but my mom won't let me. I'm like, all right, well, let me make a blueprint where here's the points you can hit. Go tell your mom all these things and talk her into it. I think that would be a fun conversation.
Exactly. And then you got to let them have the car, too, and tell them the whole trash can story, too. Yeah. Or just when you ship your crested geckos, you got to put them in, like, a makeshift, like, trash can, I guess, instead of a
trash boxes.
Right, yeah.
Origin. That's where it all started.
Awesome. So, and then when you got into breeding crested geckos, how did that start? I think from your website, you said 2008 is when you got started into, like, really being serious about crested geckos?
Yeah, so, like, 2008, 2009 is when I started breeding. So I kind of... Accident isn't the quite word, but very fortunate circumstances. Like I said, I always had pet reptiles, but I never really even knew breeding reptiles was a thing. I just, would catch a couple frogs or a snake, or I had a leopard gecko that got passed from a friend to me. And then I worked nights for like 16 years. I worked nights at UPS. There was one night I was with my then girlfriend, and I wanted to go home. I was like, I have to go to bed. I have to work at 6 hours. I was exhausted and grumpy. And this girl's like, no, let's go into PetSmart. I just want to look at the animals. And she drugged me, a very unhappy, grumpy Brian, who did not want to be there, drugged me into PetSmart, and then asked the guy in the reptile section to take one of the geckos out so we could look at it. And it's made me laugh that, like, if I had my way, I never would have been in that store. I was tired. I wanted to go home. And then immediately this guy pulled out this crested gecko, and I was like, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life. This is the most unique animal ever. And I fell in love with them instantly. It wasn't until like a year later that I was in a better spot personally and had my own place and decided, I'm going to get a couple. I remember that cool lizard I saw that night, and I went on Craigslist and found a girl selling 2 geckos in a cage. I actually still have the cage. My first cage I got, it's a hexagon tank and a nice stand, like a hexagon fish tank.
Yeah.
And I bought them for $60 for 2 geckos, and the cage was set up, the whole thing, for $60 off Craigslist, just intending to have them as pets. And then a friend of mine, I invited her over to my house to see my cool new lizards, and she comes over and goes, oh yeah, I have one of these. Mine's a boy. My boyfriend said he's going to buy me a female so I can breed them. And it was like a light bulb moment in my head. I'd never even considered it. And I was just like, you mean you can make more of these things? Like at your house, you can just make more. Like, that sounds incredible. I got to give this a try. And then from there, it was, you get online and, at that point, a gecko was a gecko to me. I had no idea about anything. And then I discovered there's all these different morphs and patterns and mutations, and you can breed specifically to make different patterns. And it just like was opening this whole world that I instantly was like, this is something I have got to do. This is incredible. I got to try this.
Right. Well, that's crazy. And then from that part where you were interested into breeding, did you even know that there was different morphs or different color variations at all in cresteds?
That's really what got me into the idea of breeding. It's like, it was an intriguing idea, just the idea that you could take to get like, obviously it's basic biology. Of course you can make animals breed, but I'd never considered that I could do that at my house, just hatch little geckos and then have more geckos than I did the day before.
Yeah.
That was like an intriguing idea, but then when I got online and got into this whole world of morphs and different mutations and, line breeding, specific breeding, it was like, oh no, this isn't just like, oh, let's make a few more geckos. This is like living artwork. Like you can, the idea, the thing that draws me to breeding is really boils down to the idea that I can have an animal in my head that physically doesn't exist in the world, and then I can make it.
Wow.
It reminds me of artwork. People say, I have this idea for a painting, and then they create it. It's like the fact that you can do that with a living creature, that's just endlessly fascinating to me.
Right. Interesting. So did you ever have that vision before of this is where this is going to go? Because I feel like a lot of people don't even think that way when they get into crested geckos. I feel like it's like, this gecko's pretty, so let's make more of these pretty geckos that look similar to the parents. But I feel like your perspective is more of like creation and kind of being more of like the artist, if you will, in your mind.
Yeah.
Did you always have that vision from breeding?
Pretty much, yeah. I pretty quickly went from, I have a couple pet geckos to, I want to do this. I want to make a business out of this. I want like this to be the focus of my life. And it was pretty quick that I established it into, this is going to be a business. And you can actually, it's probably backwards for you guys, but on my sign, my company logo is quality, refinement, progression. And that was the whole idea, was start with quality animals, refine the traits, and then progression. I want to create things that people haven't made yet. I want to make new animals, new combinations, new mutations.
Yeah, that's super cool, because I feel like a lot of people, regardless of what reptile they get into, it takes a while for them to learn that and get over that learning curve. It usually takes like them going to PetSmart and buying PetSmart geckos and then starting a breed. And then they realize, oh, like there's higher quality, and then it takes them a while to get there. But the fact that you kind of got that on your own from the beginning is super impressive. Someone to go for that quality in the beginning.
Yeah, I had that idea early on. The execution was not that simple. I learned a lot of lesson the hard way.
Right. As we all do.
People, how do you start? And I always tell them, like, plan your projects on paper. Like, literally write out, what do I want to breed? What are my goals? And then buy the animals to fill those projects.
Right.
Because the way most people do it is, that one's pretty, I'll buy it. That one's pretty, I'll buy it. These 50 in the wholesale pack all look pretty nice, I'll buy them. That's what I did. And then you end up with 200 geckos, and half of them fit into your breeding projects, half of them you have no real breeding use for, and it's like totally chaotic. And I definitely learned that the hard way.
Yeah. So would you say now that you're pretty strict in terms of your vision and your projects, and do you feel like you're really narrow into what you want to do, or do you feel like sometimes you have issues where certain things don't fit into projects and you have issues with finding out what geckos you're planning to breed in the future and planning from what you have now to that goal that you have in the future?
I kind of have a different problem now. Now my problem I run into is there's so much that I want to do, and I only have so much space, and I only have the ability to care for and house and properly manage so many geckos that there's several projects I would love to get into. But the whole progression thing, part of it is you need a fairly good-sized project to make progress. Like if I had one breeding pair of a specific morph, yeah, I can make a few more of those, but I'm going to hatch 6 to 8 babies a year. You're not going to make progress that way.
Right.
So there's a lot of morphs that it's like, if I'm going to do this morph and then combine it with other things, like this whole project needs to be 30 to 50 animals. I don't have room for 50 more breeders. I can't do that project. And then you get into, well, maybe I can cut this other project down to make room for that. And it's like, that's my whole issue now, is managing space and what projects do I want to focus on? What projects can I cut out that I'm losing interest in?
Yeah. So it's a constant cycle, and it's super hard, especially because space is a big thing. Time is also a big thing. You only have so much time in a day to care for geckos and obviously shipping and customer service and so much. So I'm totally with you on that. It's always like kind of this cycle and this scale that you're trying to keep in balance at all times.
Yeah, it's a definite balancing act.
Yeah. Do you feel like as you progress, do you feel like you're getting better at that and you're using I don't know, just different ways and different things that you add into the equation of finding out the way to, have the quality geckos that you're wanting, but also with the size that you're at? Or do you feel like it's still kind of as difficult as it was in the beginning?
It kind of comes and goes in waves. There's been times when, I've definitely taken more steps to be able to address those things at different times in different ways. And there's also been points in my life where you get lazy and you're not as focused on, presenting your animals. Like, animal care, obviously, is always taken very seriously, but the business side of things, especially, is where, there's been points where I get lazy for a couple years and, I'm selling geckos and doing okay, but then one day I'm just like, I'm not managing my social media correctly. I'm not presenting my geckos in the best way. I'm not doing the best tactics to maximize how many people I can reach and what I can do with my sales and proper customer service. And that's where I found the hard part, is keeping that side of the passion going, where you manage all of that stuff up to the level that I need to. And I've got to the point where, obviously animal care got to the point at one point where I had to bring in someone to help me with that. But that's obvious because it's easy to see. It's animal care. You can't neglect the animals. That's a non-negotiable. But then it took me a lot longer, frankly, way too long, to get to a point where I realized, I need help with social media management and customer service and sales and all this other stuff too that I'm not managing properly. I should also get help with that. That was another lesson that it took me way too long to learn, but it's easy to get in your head, I'm doing okay and my animals are taken care of, so that's all I need to do. But, when you're running a business, that's not the case. That's not how you make a successful business.
Right. Yeah, and it goes back to your tagline about progression and wanting to progress your business and, what you're breeding, and then also just making the business grow just as an entity. So was there kind of a moment where you kind of just sat down and you were at the drawing board and you were like, hey, let's work on social media and let's work on, I know you ship geckos overseas and you're working on your overseas customers and helping out people with just information in your YouTube. Was there kind of a moment, or did it take you a while where it was like a process of getting to the drawing board and making those steps?
There are, I would say, a lot of little moments. There was 5 or 6 years ago, there was a point where I'd progressed to where selling geckos was my main income. And at that point, I got a bit lazy, to be candid. And I was like, okay, now I make a living selling geckos. And I wasn't putting my full effort into the business part of things. And I kind of coasted for about 2 years. And then one day I kind of woke up and looked around and went, there's a whole bunch of people that are doing things way more effectively, way more successfully than I am. I need to kind of get my butt in gear a little bit and take this seriously. Just getting by isn't good enough.
Right.
And then I got much more serious with social media engagement and, making my company name a more public image for people to see my animals, and, got into having a schedule that I have to post pictures and get engagement on social media. And then that all kind of culminated in last year. I set goals in 2021 on the number. I really got down to a schedule of I have to post X amount of times a day, and I want to get so much engagement throughout the week. And I had guidelines in my head, and I was doing it all myself.
Nice.
At the end of last year, I realized I was so focused on, social media numbers and engagement and getting my brand and my animals out there in front of eyes, that I was totally neglecting the customer service side of things, which is obviously a terrible recipe, because all that engagement is meant to get people interested in your animals. Well, if they buy something and can't talk to you about it, they're not going to be interested in your animals anymore. It doesn't matter
Right.
how nice your geckos are.
True.
Business sucks. People want to do business with you.
Yeah.
So at the beginning of this year, I finally hired a girl that she now runs my social media accounts, does all my posts, like all of those benchmarks I set. Those are now her responsibility. That X amount of posts a day, sales days, these posts have to be up, engagement levels, and she also answers a lot of my customer emails and messages and Facebook responses and all of that. So that all got taken off my back.
Nice.
And people, for the most part now, I'm much better about responding to customers and getting people's questions answered. And even stuff that has nothing to do with my business, just being a decent person. When a kid messages you and says, hey, I have this problem with my gecko, can you help me? Like, to be able to get back to those people and help them with their geckos, like, that's just being a decent human. And it was just got to a point where I couldn't physically do that, and I had to address that issue and get help to be able to do it. Which, like I said, took me, honestly, too long to identify that and get the proper help, but it's definitely something, that's part of it that I've worked on addressing.
Yeah, and it's super cool that you're able to eventually just get to that point, because there's probably some people that are stuck in that cycle or too far on one end of the spectrum or too far on the other end of the spectrum, and it's hard just in general trying to find that middle ground. But it was cool that you're able to kind of find that issue and then also address the solution with some of the things that you've managed to do over there.
Yeah, like, it's been a learning curve. 'Cause, like most of us, I got into this just wanting to breed geckos, and they were cool, and I liked all the different colors. And like I said, I very quickly identified I'm going to make a business out of this. But, at the time I was a 20-year-old kid. I had no idea what running a business actually was.
Right.
So in the last 14 years of trying to learn about, what does running a business mean? I had customer relations and invoicing and taxes and all these other things, making sure you respond to your customers and have a decent response time on Facebook Messenger and all these, you don't consider that kind of stuff when you just think, oh, I want to breed geckos. That seems like a cool job.
True.
And I think that's why it took me a lot longer than it should have to properly address those things, is I just never, that wasn't something I was ever planning on having to deal with when I got into this. I should have, but it just never crossed my mind.
Yeah, true. And especially just dealing with live reptiles in the first place, it's way different than a lot of other businesses, just in the fact that you're dealing with live animals. So just that, and having to deal with shipping and live shipping, I think that was another thing for me, especially that took a while to figure out and how to be on top of that. So there's so many different things that we don't take into account when it comes to not just breeding, but the business side of it.
Yeah, when you get into the business side, it's so much more complex than you ever imagine.
Right.
And it's, even if you're already somebody who's familiar with business and how to run a business, well, now you're working with live animals. I wish I could show you the look when I got my first CPA to do all my taxes, and he wanted my end of year inventory list. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? What is that? I was 22 years old. I had an inventory. And he's like, well, how many products? How many products did you buy? How many products do you sell? What product do you still have in stock? And I'm like, I don't buy products. They just get created in my basement by the geckos. I don't know how to do an inventory list. And the look on his face, because he's just used to, I bought 500 t-shirts and I sold 320 of them. I have 180 left. Here's my cost, my profit, my margins. Well, what's your margin ratio on a gecko that you hatched in your basement from a gecko you paid $800 for 12 years ago and a gecko you paid $500 for 6 months ago? How can you possibly calculate a profit margin on that one baby, but they're going to probably have 25 more babies in the next 4 years, so then that skews your profit margin on what you paid for those adults. Normal business tactics don't really apply to live animals.
Yeah.
So even that was a whole learning experience on how to do all that.
Yeah, I feel like what you just said just gave a few people listening a headache, just them thinking about it.
It still gives me a headache. I'm at the point where I'm like, I think my tax guy's figured out how to do this. I just bring him all my papers and give it to him and say, dude, figure it out and send me a bill. I don't want anything to do with it.
Yeah, and I feel like that's one thing that a lot of people, one thing I've struggled with is kind of, you said you hired someone, which is super awesome to be able to get to that point where you're able to hire someone. But I feel like just delegating tasks to different people when you're at that point where you can afford it, you have space for your geckos, and you're able to not do things on your own as much. I feel like there's other tasks that take priority within just the business side of things that you have to. You can't always spend 10 hours cleaning geckos when you have other things that are kind of almost hindering your businesses from growing bigger. So did you have any issues
Yeah.
with delegation and growth with delegation as well?
Yeah, it's definitely something that's a juggling act too, is figuring out what can I delegate to someone else and then what makes sense to delegate. Like, I have a ton of business ideas, a couple that I'm working now to get off the ground, and a bunch more that I can't even begin to start on.
Right.
And I don't have time. I only have so many hours in the day, and I still have tasks here that I could delegate to somebody. Like all of the breeders, I personally feed all my breeders. I collect all my eggs. I do all of my shipping. Like, I could delegate all those tasks to somebody, but I want to be in charge. Like, I want my hands on. I want to pair the geckos. I want to track which eggs come from what pairs, so I know wherever all the babies are coming from, and then what I'm going to do with those offspring down the line. It's like, if I delegate that to somebody, then I'm losing part of the breeding side of the business, that I am the only person who is hands-on deciding what geckos get paired to what am I going to create. I could give all that up and put it in someone else's hands, and then that would free my time to do this other business idea I have, but I have to decide, is that worth it?
Right.
For a lot of the time, I've decided that's not worth it. I spend a good deal of my time cleaning cages and feeding breeders and collecting eggs, and it sucks and it's tedious and it's not fun work, but what I get out of it isn't something I'm willing to give up. I think I would lose the essence of what I do for a living if I handed that over to someone else.
Especially just that's part of your identity and who Altitude Exotics is. 'Cause at the end of the day, you know, Brian is running the business and you're creating all the breeding plans. So if you kind of let that to someone else to take over, it's not even really you kind of behind the message of the geckos you're creating.
Yeah, and then, you know, it might lead to other successes from a business point of view. I've always used Pangea reptiles as like a divergent, almost like a parallel universe version of me.
Okay.
Because me and Matt from Pangea were somewhat similar back in the day. He started about 5 years before I did, so he was definitely there before I was. But he mainly started as a gecko breeder. He was breeding geckos, selling geckos, and then he obviously got into selling Pangea diets, and he has an enormous dry goods business now that, you know, and he's got a huge number of employees and delegates all kinds of stuff. And I'm making some assumptions here because I don't know Matt all that well and I don't know his day-to-day life, but I have to imagine, I know he doesn't price a lot of the geckos, especially at shows. He has people, like, even pricing geckos. Nobody prices my geckos but me. I want to know. I want to be able to say what they're worth. What do I want for this particular animal? At what point would I rather keep this animal and sell it for a lower price? Like, Matt, I believe, has given up a lot of that control. That's not something I'm willing to give up. On the other hand, Matt is wildly successful with his dry goods business and his warehouse and all the shows they vend and selling caging and setup, and he manufactures his own food ledges and feeding dishes and like all kinds of stuff that I could never imagine doing, but I'm sitting down here picking gecko eggs out and labeling them all day. Of course, I'm going to make my own line.
Right.
So it's almost like we started in the same place and took divergent paths, and I'm very successful on my path and he's wildly successful on his. It's not a right or a wrong answer. It's just interesting what choice you make. He made one, I made the other, and it's worked out fantastically for him. So
True. Yeah, and it's also really, really cool to kind of hear just the different stories of also just where Pangea's ended up in terms of like creating a massively insane like food line that's pretty much up the top two food lines that people either use Repashy or Pangea pretty much. And it's crazy just to see where that's taken off as well, but then also seeing your success in the way that you've done things and making sure you're staying hands-on, but then also you're not dealing with accessories and food. So it's kind of like different things that you're working through in terms of the business and the strategy on that end.
yeah, it's interesting to me to think about that. Like, and you know, Pangea still hatches geckos. Matt still has amazing animals and hatches some incredible looking animals. But it's almost like he's now the dry goods, food supply, reptile leader industry business who also happens to have some great geckos. Whereas I'm the gecko dude. That's all I do is geckos. And I have in the past sold some dry goods and I have a few other things I do, but It's mainly geckos.
True. Yeah, and that's where your passion lies too. So it's
Yeah.
cool to see that's where that stream is still going. Because even a lot of people, when they do start with something and they start with one animal, say cresteds, and then they get into other animals because of the market's good in that industry, or say with accessories, it's cool to sell ledges and stuff while you're at shows, which is a good business strategy. But then also it can lose your focus and be a distraction as well to what your main focus is.
Yeah, that's really the decision I made. I attempted at one point. I was like, I'm going to open a whole dry goods side. And I built a whole website for it and opened it and had food and ledges and all the stuff on there. And I very quickly realized, like, I kind of did it halfway. And I had it on the website, but I'm not. It needs to, that's a high volume business, whereas my geckos are high price, low volume. I was like, I'm trying to run these the same, and that doesn't work. That business strategy doesn't work for both. So I either need to go all in on the dry goods and have high volume, all the different accessories, and I need to get a warehouse to stock all this stuff and really go full tilt at it, or I just got to stop because I'm selling 8 bags of food a week at a $2.50 profit a bag. This is not worth $20 profit a week. I don't have time for that. And then if you don't, you run out of time and you don't ship your food, well, people get mad because I ordered this food. It was supposed to be here today and my gecko's hungry and you didn't ship it out on time. It just wasn't a recipe for success. I learned pretty quick. That was not where I thrive in business. It wasn't the right move for me. I abandoned that idea pretty quick.
Yeah, it's also a pain just thinking about getting orders and just different shipping, and instead of if you have different shipping days for geckos, you have to kind of work with the customer and you kind of lose a lot of that control.
And it's also finding what you're good at. I found out I'm not good at that. I'm not good at selling small bags of food and shipping them quickly and efficiently, and it just wasn't whereas Matt's business is incredibly good at that. There's a lot of people out there that thrive on dry goods and they're very good at it. I was not good. It just wasn't what I was good at. Yeah.
And it's always hard to kind of even figure that out. And even when it comes to your geckos and some of the projects you're working with, I noticed that you're just super selective in terms.
And that's going to wrap us up for this episode of the podcast. Thanks, Brian, for coming on to the podcast. Thanks, everybody, for listening. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed just interviewing Brian and having a great time connecting on both the gecko level and the reptile industry level, and then also the personal level, getting into his trips and photography and so many other things that we covered in this episode. As you guys know, at the end of each and every episode, I do my one big thing. And this episode, something that really just stuck out to me and something that I really took was really just being a well-rounded person when it comes to the reptile industry and the reptile hobby. I think sometimes, for me, I know I could struggle with getting to everybody's messages. When we talk about the business side of things, there's some things that are obviously non-negotiables that we talked about, such as reptile care and caring for your animals. That should always be our number one priority. But when it comes to marketing and social media and answering everybody's questions and doing all the other things that it takes to really grow your business, it's really easy to just put everything into autopilot, especially if you're doing well in selling. But then so many other things could get under wraps that could be helping really just grow what you're doing as an owner and as a business person. And even if you're doing it on a hobbyist level, there's some times where we could just take things and really just not see how we could be doing things better for people in terms of education and so many other things. So I just want to think about that, especially for me, and see how I could best delegate my time to be more well-rounded and help people out in that way, but then also make sure that care and husbandry and sales and everything else is going really well. So for me, that's going to be my one big thing for this episode, and hopefully you guys can reflect on that and take a little bit of something from that as well. I want to thank everyone for joining us on yet another episode of the Strength in Leos podcast. Don't forget to share with a friend, rate our podcast, and subscribe. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Strength in Leos, and last but not least, tune in next time for our next episode on Spotify, iTunes, Google Music, and our website, strengthinleos.com. This is your host, Evan Woldridge, signing off. Continue to grow in knowledge and share the strength in Leos.